Yes, so just beginning to settle into your meditation posture. I like to start with a little bit of movement, maybe rocking the body from side to side and front to back. And just to loosen up any tension and to allow the body to come into a balanced, upright position. And sensing the weight of the body on your seat. Releasing the belly and allowing the body to continue to settle right here in this place. Turning the attention to the sensations of hearing. No need to strain at all, just noticing hearing that arises. And noticing when it passes. Sensations of hearing cannot be grasped. They're here when they're here, and they're gone when they're gone. Being curious about the sensations of hearing, mind attending to sounds rising and ceasing. As we come to the end of the meditation, just listening carefully to the sounds of the bell all the way until the end. That brings us to the end of the meditation. Excuse me for just one moment, speaking of sound. So now I'm on the Spanish channel. Can you say something, Claudia? No, no te escucho. Ah, sí, ahora sí te escucho. Sí. ¿Eh? Sí, te escucho bien. Ok, listo. Okay, I'm back. Can everybody on this English channel hear me? All right, lovely. Thank you for your patience there. And so I'll go ahead and begin with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So welcome again, everyone. This week, I would like to continue to talk about the Valama Sutta, the sutta that I started on last week. And don't worry if you weren't here last week. We'll catch you up a little bit. And so the sutta is numbered discourse number 9 from the chapter of nines, number 20. And it is the Buddha having a conversation with Anathapindika. Anathapindika was a very wealthy lay person who came to be one of the Buddha's key students, key disciples. And I imagine that this conversation was happening early in their relationship because of the way that it unfolds. But basically, it's a teaching. The Buddha is giving a teaching about the benefits of certain kinds of practice, and he lists very clearly a hierarchy of benefit, meaning that there are certain practices that are more powerful than others. And so he begins by asking Anathapindika if his family gives gifts, and Anathapindika says, we only give very poor gifts of rice, gruel, and pickles. We give this very kind of chintzy, would be the American word, this kind of not so rich, not so nice food to folks who come asking for food. And the Buddha very clearly says it's not actually about that the point of gift giving, or that the key factor to considering gift giving is the intention with which it's given, whether it's given respectfully and with consideration, or whether it's given disrespectfully and without consideration. These are the things that make the difference between a gift that will actually be beneficial or not. And so he says, if you give it carefully and thoughtfully with your own hand, then that will tend to be more beneficial. And so right away, the subtle sort of message that the Buddha is giving here is that our intentions, whenever we take action, including actions such as generosity, our intentions matter. the motivations that we have for doing certain things and the way in which we do them with care or without care, it makes a difference. It makes a difference in the way that the natural effects of those things unfold, you could say. So in any event, he goes on to talk about giving various kinds of gifts, many kinds of gifts. And he says that in a previous life, he was a very wealthy person and he gave lots of material things. Now, whether you believe in, previous lives or not, I would say the Buddha is sharing that with us because he's basically saying, I know what I'm talking about. I've done this in the past, and I've seen now, by virtue of my insight and my awakening, I've seen now what the effects were down the road. That's what he's saying. And so he goes on to say that it's actually that the kind of gifts that you're giving is less important than the kind of person that you're giving to, actually. That if you're giving to somebody who is more spiritually advanced, that actually has a more benefit for you in terms of, again, sort of setting up these positive karmic consequences. And why would that be? I would suggest that one reason is, and the Buddha doesn't actually mention the reason here, but I would suggest that one reason is because when we're giving to someone who is, for example, working to end greed, hatred, and delusion in themselves and in the world, then that gift will have further benefits in the world, right? We know that that gift will end up creating, waves of good in various ways, or it would have at least that general tendency. And again, the way in which these consequences or these results are playing out is very complex. It's unwise to think of it in terms of point A and point B, although we can sometimes observe that, but it's a very complex phenomena, what we're talking about here. So much so that the Buddha said that karma and the effects of karma, which we call vipaka or resultants, karma is one of the four imponderables, the four things that if you try to know them 100% with 100% predictability, that would make you crazy. He said it would literally drive you crazy. So the four things are the scope of the mind of an arhat, the scope of the mind of an enlightened being, the workings of karma, the workings of the world, and the scope of someone in jhana, the mind of someone who's in an absorption meditation. And I would say most likely that more advanced absorptions, particularly, which are boundless, right? That's exactly, the way, by definition, they are not able to be conceived of. In any event, I'm getting off on a tangent. So the Buddha is talking about various practices and various kinds of giving. And he's talking about giving to different types of people. And then he says, even giving, so like, for example, giving a building to the whole of the Sangha would be more beneficial than feeding 100 arhats or 100 even Buddhas. And it's interesting, right? So oftentimes there's this misconception about early Buddhism that we only talk about one Buddha, the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, the sage of the Shakya clan. That's what his name means. Shakya is his clan name, and Muni means sage or the wise one, right? And yet here we have, among many, we have one sutta in which the Buddha is very clearly speaking about other Buddhas. Yeah? So he talks a little bit about giving to them, and then he talks about this building. And then, as I mentioned toward the end of my talk last week, then there's a pivot, a very strong shift in the sutta, in which the Buddha says, and more beneficial than all of that, giving tens of thousands of coins and elephants and meals and buildings and so on, more beneficial than that would be to take refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. The act of taking refuge is incredibly powerful practice. So again, he's not saying don't do those other things. He's saying that we should know the power of our practice. And so the power of turning, so taking refuge might mean something like having the intention to rely on Buddhist wisdom, to rely on the wonderful folks in history who discovered this path and shared this path, to rely on the Buddha as a human being who demonstrated and clearly said to pretty much anybody who would listen, human beings can do this practice. If you want to do it, here's how you do it. Right? And the Buddha also then as a demonstration of our own human capacity for awakening. So when we turn our minds to being willing to rely on that, to refer to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha as a source of wisdom, as a source of sanity in a world which is very confused, then that is very beneficial. That's very powerful practice. But that's where we left off last week. So now this next step. So again, he's going on and talking about things, each type of practice being more beneficial than the last. So the next type of practice, which he says is even more beneficial than taking refuge, is to practice the 5 precepts, the 5 lay precepts of early Buddhism. And what are they? I undertake the precept to refrain from taking the life of any living creature. I undertake the precept to refrain from taking that which is not given. I undertake the precept to refrain from sexual misconduct. I undertake the precept to refrain from false and harmful speech. And I undertake the precept to refrain from intoxicants, various kinds of intoxicants, which lead to carelessness or lead to confusion in the mind. So this kind of practice is, again, very powerful, very clearly demonstrating the strength that our intention has in shaping the results of our lives, the future results that we might experience. Right? So setting your heart on following the precepts means, again, that you start to live your life in a way that demonstrates your understanding of the results of certain kinds of behaviors. Right? I'm going to not do some kinds of behaviors because I know that those will bring some nasty results. Right? And sometimes it feels like we really can't follow that. Like we really have to break a precept, or we really have to, make another choice. And I find, oftentimes when that happens, we really need to ask ourselves, what's going on? And I'll give you a good example. So when I lived many years ago, I lived at a monastery called Tassajara Zen Mountain Monastery. That's the monastery in California, in the Carmel Valley, about Mm, uh, 2 or 2.5 hours inland from Carmel, which is a city between San Francisco and Los Angeles on the coast of California. Okay, California in the U.S. And so it's a very remote monastery. The closest house is an hour down the road. The closest gas station is an hour and 45 minutes. So you better have enough gas to get where you're going before you leave the monastery. And Tassajara is a wonderful place to practice, very traditional place to practice. It's one of the three campuses, if you will, of San Francisco Zen Center. So anyway, so I was living there at Tassajara, and I'd come to Tassajara actually after my monastic training in Japan, because I thought it would be the next closest thing in the United States. And sure enough, Tassajara was in many ways similar to Japan, but it's also quite different, quite different. And one of the ways that it was different was the way that we thought about the animals in our space. So when I arrived at Tassajara, I learned that we had all kinds of wildlife, and I mean all kinds. So we had cougars, and we had deer, and we had rattlesnakes, and we had mice, and we had rats. And we didn't try to kill any of those beings, any of them, or trap them, or make them move to another area. We didn't do any of that. And now you would think, I would think anyway, that it would be kind of nasty and unhealthy to be living with rats. But somehow we very peacefully coexisted with them. And, we tried to keep them out of the kitchen. That was a big priority. You keep the rats and the mice out of the kitchen as best you can. But there was a funny moment in which we were in the hallway in one of the dormitories. It was the women's dormitory that year. So there was one dormitory which would switch among the different genders year by year, because it was the nicest one. It was the closest one to the Zendo. And anyway, there was something wrong with the plumbing in the women's dorm that winter. And so I was standing there, and my friend was there taking a plate off the wall to kind of check on the plumbing. And he takes the plate off the wall, and there's this huge pipe, this big, metal pipe, which with a valve at one end, which is what he was looking for. And sitting on that nice warm pipe of hot water, there's this white rat, like about yay big, like a foot long, perfectly, immaculately clean white rat sitting there on the pipe. And so I kind of held my breath for a second. And my friend, who had been at Tassajara longer than me, a few years longer than me, just went about his business. He just went and fooled around with the valve and did what he needed to do. And the rat sat perfectly still and just waited for us to do what we needed to do and put the plate back on the wall. And I thought, wow, we are coexisting, right? And as long as that creature isn't doing some harm to one of us or to our space, then we're okay. Sure, sit there on the warm pipe. Absolutely. Have at it. So I say that because, and I could tell you many more stories about mice and rats, actually, at Tassajara, but I won't. But I just say that as an example of, this precept of not taking the life of another creature, right? I think up until that point, I might have thought that that would be an exception, that a rat in the monastery dorm might be an exception. But no, actually, we didn't need to. So this is very powerful practice. Again, taking the precepts, setting your intention for an ethical life, for clarity of mind, for lack of remorse, for non-agitation, for feeling good about the choices you're making, for many reasons. And then the next one. And what is the next one? Even more powerful than that is the practice of metta, the practice of loving kindness, for as long as it takes to pull a cow's udder. So Claudia, who's doing interpretation, you know, the udder of the cow is like the little pink part underneath, which, yeah, she's got it. Okay. And I have never milked a cow, so I've never pulled a cow's udder, but I hear from people who have, actually, like my sister Ananda Bodhi, my friend, good friend, Ayya Dhammadipa, that it's about like so. Shh, that's about that amount of time. Right? So metta, the practice of loving kindness. I like to think of it as universal kindness. So again, we set our intention. May all beings be well. May this being be well. May the rats be well. May my friends in the dorm be well. May all of you be well. May all beings be well. May people governing, may people waging war, may all people, all beings be well, right? Beings we can't even imagine. The Buddha spoke about all kinds of beings that we can't even necessarily accept or imagine sometimes. So what is it to open your heart that big? Your heart mind, that big, boundless. The Buddha said this practice of metta, right? Boundless, immeasurable, abundant. Yeah, to fill your heart with that intention over and over and over again, if you're reciting, or over and over and over again, if you're meditating, filling that vast, vast, boundless mind with such a beautiful quality. Of course, that's going to be powerful because it stretches us beyond our self-concern. It stretches us beyond this constant state of judging the world by whether it's good for me. And it shows us actually the capacity of our minds. When you practice this metta meditation, it says metta in the first direction, let's say in front of you, to the right of you, behind you, to the left of you, above and below. And that becomes more and more and more vast. And you realize, perhaps, the extent to which you allow your mind to be usually constrained, tightened, defined by something so small, rather than allow that spaciousness. That's an incredibly powerful practice, to find that vastness and to find that willingness to set the intention. You don't have to be perfect at executing. You can work on that, right? But the intention is what drives this whole process. So metta is more powerful than all those other things. In fact, there's another sutta in which the Buddha says that the practice, if you want to set up favorable conditions for a better future rebirth, and I would add, and in this lifetime too, if you want to set up favorable conditions in the future, then metta as a practice is 16 times more powerful than the next thing. Very, very powerful practice. And there's one more in this sutta, which I will share about, and then we'll stop and take some questions. And the last one, even more powerful than metta. Imagine that. So hold on for a second. A practice which is even more powerful than a completely limitless mind pervaded by the most beautiful intention for well-being for all. A practice more powerful than that is the perception of impermanence for as long as it takes to snap your finger. One finger snap worth of the I would say profound perception of impermanence is enough to change your whole life, to change your whole mind, to shift your entire worldview. And you might think, well, yeah, okay. We're seeing impermanence all the time, here or there. And yet, there is some way in which we are still resisting impermanence. Presumably many ways. Many ways in which, excuse me. I just flew across the Atlantic Ocean this morning, so my throat is a little dry. Many ways in which we are resisting the fact of impermanence, even if we conceptually are on board, right? So I'll tell you quickly one story about my friend when I was doing chaplaincy training, Kelly. And Kelly, I had said something about the practice, the teaching of impermanence and sort of this, how we resist impermanence. And that's one of the key, if not the key, sources of suffering for us. And she said, I don't think I'm doing that. And I said, okay, well, maybe you could check it out. You could think about it. And so then Kelly came to me a couple of days later and she said, you know what? So there I was getting ready to leave the house. And I know that the weather forecast says it's going to rain. And then I look out and it's sunny. And I say to myself, oh, I don't need to bring my umbrella. And then she said, and then when I'm walking from my car to the hospital and getting rained on, I'm thinking of you. Because there I am without my umbrella. Why? Because I wasn't willing to accept the idea, even though somebody told me it's likely that the weather would change. Right? And I totally cracked up with Kelly because I told her I had done that a million times when I was in college. I went to college in Miami, and in the weather there is such that it very consistently rains in the afternoon. So it would be exactly the same scenario. It's nice, it's sunny, it's lovely. I leave the house without my umbrella, despite all knowledge, despite the fact that I got rained on the day before, right? Didn't matter. So we had a good laugh about it, Kelly and I, and we actually, both had some insight into the nature of the resistance of impermanence, against impermanence in our lives. Just these many, many small and big ways in which we're not able to say yes. But when we drop very, very clearly, profoundly into a moment of insight about that, just right, a finger snap moment of insight about impermanence, then it's actually impossible to cling, at least to that thing that you've had an insight about, right? If you have a handful of sand and you see that the sand is slipping out of your hand all the time, then you would naturally just let go because you know that it's not possible to hold on to it, right? You just let go. And in the same way, when we see impermanence, when we see that all things are slipping through our hands, whether in life or in death, whether in this moment or in another moment, then we will not cling to them anymore. It just doesn't make sense. So I wish you plenty of rainy days, or whatever it is that it takes to help you to be willing to see impermanence. And I wish you many, many, many days of beautiful, fruitful metta practice. And I wish you many days of upright and ethical life of precept practice, because those things, and refuge, and of course, many, 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 many times, I hope, of taking refuge, because all of those things are incredibly powerful and they are doing their work on you. You put forth the intention and then karma does its work on you. So thank you all for listening today.